I was already living in Mexico when I started thinking too much. That's probably the simplest way to say it. I had retired the year before, sold most of what I didn't need, and moved south with 2 suitcases and a stack of paperwork I didn't fully understand anymore. 66 years old, no alarm clock, no supervisor, no reason to rush unless I created one. Back in the States, retirement felt strange almost immediately. The days weren't bad, they just didn't push back. I could finish everything I needed to do before lunch and still have hours left to account for. After a while, I stopped pretending errands were tasks and admitted they were excuses to leave the house. Mexico wasn't a dramatic decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't post about it. I spent a lot of late nights sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, closing it, reopening it, reading the same listings over and over. Some places felt like they were built for people passing through. Others looked too quiet for someone who already had too much time to think. Guadalajara stuck around in my browser longer than the rest. I can't explain it better than that. It didn't sell itself. It didn't look like it was waiting for me. When I landed, the airport felt bigger than I expected. The taxi driver talked the entire ride. I understood maybe half of it, and nodded like I understood all of it. The apartment I'd rented smelled like cleaning chemicals and something fried a long time ago. I left my bags by the door and stood there longer than necessary, listening to traffic from the street below. I stayed. The first weeks were about learning where not to hesitate, crossing streets, ordering food, knowing when to step aside and when to keep moving. I walked the same routes every day until my feet stopped reminding me I wasn't used to them yet. That's how routines form. Not because you plan them, but because repeating something costs less effort than changing it. I passed the insurance office near the plaza almost every day. The sign was faded. The windows were always half covered with paperwork taped up from the inside. I didn't notice Adriana at first. Then one morning, I did. She was behind the front desk, headset on, typing with one hand and flipping through a folder with the other. When I looked up, she smiled. Not politely. Just briefly, like people do when they recognize something familiar. The next day, I slowed down without realizing it. She nodded. A few days later, I stopped and asked where people nearby went for coffee when they didn't want to wait in line. She told me which place to avoid in the mornings and which one stayed quiet after lunch. The next day, she asked if she was right. That was it. We didn't exchange numbers right away. We talked in pieces, a few minutes here, a few minutes there, about work mostly. Her job was paperwork heavy. Claims, mistakes other people made that became her problem. She spoke about it plainly, without complaining, and without pretending it mattered more than it did. After a couple of weeks, I asked if she wanted to get coffee together instead of pointing me somewhere else. She said yes, checked her watch, and told me when her shift ended. She showed up in different clothes, hair still pulled back, looking like she hadn't planned the day around the meeting. I liked that. We sat, drank coffee, talked about nothing in particular. When she said she had to leave, she left. We kept it that way for a while. Coffee turned into dinner once a week, then twice. Walks on Sundays. Sitting on benches and watching people pass without narrating it. She didn't ask many questions about my past. I didn't offer much. When things came up naturally, we talked about them. She was 31. I didn't forget that. I didn't pretend it didn't matter, but I also didn't feel like I needed to explain myself for noticing her. I paid for most things because I had more money and fewer expenses. She paid when she wanted to. There were no discussions about it, no tallying, no speeches. I noticed she never reached for her wallet and then waited. If she paid immediately. If she didn't apologize. That detail stayed with me. I don't remember when we started calling each other a couple. It just stopped sounding strange when someone else did it first. Marriage came up the same way everything else had. Gradually. Without pressure. We were already spending most nights together. Already making plans that assumed the other person would be there. Which apartment made more sense? Which day worked better for groceries? Who was picking up what? We got married in the US because we were already going there to see my sister. Courthouse. 2 witnesses. Short ceremony. Adriana wore a dress she already owned. I wore a jacket I'd had for years. We went to lunch afterward and talked about our return flight. I didn't feel like I'd crossed into something new. It felt like catching paperwork up to reality. Back in Mexico, nothing changed right away. Adriana went back to work. I went back to my routines. I paid most of the bills. She contributed where she could. We talked about the future without putting dates on anything. That's when I started hearing things. Other Americans have a way of finding each other. At cafés, hardware stores, in lines for things you don't fully understand yet. Conversations that start casual and turn serious without warning. Stories about marriages that shifted once money got tighter. Divorces that took more than expected. Men who said things like, "I never thought it would happen to me." I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't repeat those stories at home. Instead, I started paying attention. Not because Adriana gave me a reason, because I'd spent most of my life fixing problems early, replacing things before they failed. Waiting for proof had never been my strength. I noticed how she talked about plans. Whether she asked follow-up questions or let things rest, how she reacted when something cost more than expected. Nothing stood out. That bothered me more than if something had. The first time I mentioned money, it was casual. Something about costs rising, about retirement income not stretching the way it used to. Adriana listened, asked what that meant. We talked about small changes, less eating out, fewer extras. A few weeks later, I said something heavier. That I might need to work again. That going back to the US was a possibility. That retirement might not stay permanent. She didn't interrupt me. She asked what that would look like. How long? Where I'd go. What would happen with the apartment, with her job. I answered, but not all at once. After that, the conversations felt different, not tense, more careful. She started asking about savings, about timelines, about options if plans changed. One night after dinner, sitting at the table longer than usual, she said something that didn't sound like a warning but stayed with me. "We're married," she said. "So whatever happens next affects both of us." She wasn't upset. She wasn't accusing me of anything. She was stating a fact. I agreed. What I didn't say was that I'd wanted reassurance, not shared risk. I thought about backing off, about saying I'd overstated things, about letting the subject drop. But once those questions were out there, they didn't belong to just me anymore. I said we both needed to be honest about what we wanted if things changed, that no one should feel stuck. She nodded, said she appreciated that. The next morning, she left for work earlier than usual, kissed my cheek like she always did. I stayed in the doorway longer than necessary after she was gone. That afternoon, I logged into my retirement account for the first time in months. The numbers hadn't changed. I still didn't feel settled. Nothing bad had happened yet. But I knew I'd shifted something. And whatever came next wouldn't feel accidental anymore. I didn't tell myself I was testing anything. That came later, after there was a word for it. At the time, it felt more like narrowing options, like reducing variables. The way you do when something expensive is at stake and you don't trust the numbers you're looking at. The first real change wasn't money. It was plans. I stopped talking about the future the way I had before. No more next year or eventually. When Adriana brought things up, moving to a different neighborhood, taking a short trip, buying a piece of furniture we didn't need right away, I didn't shut them down, but I didn't build on them either. I said things like, "We'll see, and let's wait a bit." She noticed. Anyone would have. One evening, she asked me directly if something was wrong, not in an accusing way, more like checking whether she'd missed a step. I told her nothing was wrong, that I was just being careful. She didn't argue, she rarely did, but she started watching me in a way she hadn't before. When I paid bills, when I checked my phone, when I went quiet in the middle of a conversation, I told myself that was normal. Married people notice changes. A week later, I brought up the idea of going back to the USA. Again, this time with more detail. I said I'd been looking at job listings. Not seriously, but enough to know what was out there. Short-term contracts, consulting work, things I could do without starting over completely. I watched her face while I talked. She didn't react right away. She let me finish. Then she asked what kind of work I was looking at and where. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that it would depend on what made sense financially. Financially for who? She asked. For us, I said. She nodded, but I could tell that wasn't the answer she'd been asking for. That night, she stayed up later than usual, scrolling through her phone at the table while I washed the dishes. She wasn't hiding anything. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But the room felt divided in a way it hadn't before. The next day, she told me her mother had asked whether we were planning to stay in Mexico long term. I asked what she'd said. That we were figuring it out, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was information. A few days after that, I told her something I hadn't planned to say yet. That if I did go back to the US to work, it might make sense for me to go alone at first, just to get settled, just to see how things looked. I said it like it was practical. Temporary. She didn't respond right away. When she did, she asked whether I wanted her to come later or whether I expected her to stay in Mexico. I don't know, I said. That's part of what I'm trying to figure out. That was the first time she looked at me like she was measuring distance instead of listening. She asked if this was about money or about us. I said it was about stability. She didn't argue with that either. Over the next couple of weeks, we started having conversations that felt like meetings, not cold, but structured. We talked about her job, whether she could transfer offices, whether remote work was an option. We talked about visas, about how long she could stay in the US without issues, about what it would mean if we lived in different places for a while. I answered questions when she asked them. I didn't volunteer more than necessary. That was when I realized I wasn't just removing support. I was creating uncertainty on purpose. I told myself it was fair, that if she was with me for the right reasons, this wouldn't scare her away, that anyone worth staying with would adapt. But there were moments, small ones, where that logic didn't hold up. Like when she came home one evening with groceries and asked which card she should use. Or when she asked whether she should renew her work contract for another year or look for something more flexible. Those weren't loyalty questions, they were practical ones. And I didn't give her clear answers. Instead, I told her we needed to see how things played out. That phrase became a problem. Because things don't play out on their own. People make choices while they're waiting. One Saturday morning, she asked if we could sit down and go through our finances together. Not because she wanted access, because she wanted clarity. She said it would help her plan either way. I told her I wasn't comfortable doing that yet. She didn't push. She just said okay and changed the subject. That response bothered me more than if she'd argued. I started noticing what she stopped doing. She didn't bring up long-term plans anymore. She didn't ask about my day in the same way. She still came home at the same time, still cooked, still talked. But some things stayed unspoken. I told myself that was the point. That this was what pressure looked like. The turning point came with the bank. I needed to move money between accounts to cover a larger expense. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork and timing. Adriana asked whether I needed help with anything, since some banks required both spouses present. I said no. She asked whether she should be there anyway, just in case. I said I'd rather handle it alone. She looked at me for a long moment, and then nodded. That night, she asked whether I trusted her. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I didn't like how any answer would sound. I trust you, I said finally. She asked what that meant. I said it meant I believed she cared about me. She didn't smile at that. She said trust also meant not keeping someone in the dark while their life was tied to yours. That was the first time I felt the weight of the marriage in a way I hadn't before. Not emotionally, legally, practically. She wasn't threatening anything. She wasn't making demands. She was reminding me that this wasn't a casual arrangement anymore. I told her I needed time. She said she understood, but that she needed to make decisions too. The next few days felt stretched. Conversations happened, but they stayed on the surface. We talked about schedules, meals, errands. Not about what was underneath. I started thinking more seriously about work in the US. I made calls, sent emails. One of them came back with interest faster than I expected. A short-term contract. Not glamorous, but real. When I told Adriana about it, she asked when it would start. Soon, I said. She asked how soon. I gave her a date. She asked whether that meant I'd already decided. I said it meant I was preparing. She nodded slowly and said she needed to think. That night, she didn't come to bed at the same time. She stayed in the living room, lights on, laptop open. I heard her typing. Not frantically. Steadily. I told myself not to read into it, but I knew I was past the point of observation. Whatever this had been at the start, it was now something else. I had taken a stable situation and introduced a variable I couldn't control. And instead of getting the reassurance I thought I wanted, I was watching a person reorganize her life in response to the uncertainty I'd created. The next morning, she told me she'd spoken to a lawyer. She said it calmly, like it was a fact, not a threat. I needed to understand what my options are, she said, so I don't make decisions without information. I nodded. I understood that. I'd done the same thing more than once in my life. What I hadn't expected was the feeling that came with it, Not anger, not betrayal, a kind of hollow awareness. This wasn't a test anymore. This was movement. And once people start moving in different directions, it doesn't matter why they started. What matters is how far they're willing to go once they're in motion. That was when I understood that whatever answer I got from this stay or go, it was going to come with a cost I hadn't calculated when I first decided to be careful. And I was no longer sure which outcome would leave me worse off. After Adriana told me she'd spoken to a lawyer, the house didn't feel different right away. The chairs were in the same place. The dishes were stacked the way they always were. Her shoes sat by the door, lined up the way she liked them. If I'd walked in blindfolded, I wouldn't have known anything had changed, but I started noticing pauses, small ones. Moments where one of us waited to see if the other would speak first. She didn't bring the lawyer up again. I didn't ask what was said. We both acted like that conversation belonged to a different version of us, one that wasn't standing in the kitchen that morning deciding who was going to make coffee. I left the apartment more often after that, not dramatically, just earlier, longer walks, extra errands. I told myself it was to clear my head, but really it was because I didn't want to be the one sitting there when the next serious conversation started. I checked my email more than usual. The job lead from the US had turned into a call. Then another. They wanted to know availability, start dates, how quickly I could be there. I answered, in general terms, soon, possibly, still figuring things out. Each time I closed my laptop, I felt a little less like I was in control of anything. Adriana stayed steady on the surface. She went to work, came home at the same time, cooked, cleaned, talked about her day without oversharing. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have thought things were settling. But there were changes. She started keeping her documents together. Passport, copies of our marriage certificate. Things that used to be scattered now lived in one folder that stayed in her bag. She didn't hide it. She didn't mention it either. One evening, she asked if I'd already decided about the job. I said no. She asked whether I was leaning toward going. I said I was considering it seriously. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. Didn't ask when, didn't ask how long. That was new. A few days later, she asked if we could talk through what would happen if we separated for a while. Not divorce, just living apart. How expenses would be handled, what would happen to the apartment. I told her it felt premature. She said it felt practical. That word again, practical. It started showing up everywhere. When she talked about her job, when she talked about money, when she talked about the future. I realized then that the test I thought I was running wasn't revealing loyalty. It was forcing her to prepare. And preparation doesn't look like affection. It looks like organization. The bank came back into it sooner than I expected. I needed to move a larger sum to cover some upcoming costs tied to the potential job travel, housing deposits, things like that. I went alone, even though part of me knew it would have been easier with her there. When I got back, she asked how it went. I told her it was fine. She asked whether everything was still separate or if the accounts were fully merged now that we were married. I hesitated. She noticed. That matters, she said, not sharply, just clearly. I told her I'd kept things mostly the same, that it felt simpler. She nodded slowly. Later that night, she asked if I'd ever thought about what would happen if one of us decided to leave the marriage. I asked her if she was thinking about leaving. She said she was thinking about possibilities. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of worry in the usual sense. More because my thoughts kept circling the same realization. I had assumed loyalty meant staying no matter what. I hadn't considered that loyalty might also mean refusing to stay in something that felt unstable. The next week, she told me she'd scheduled another meeting with the lawyer. This time, she explained why. I need to understand how things work if you go back to the US, she said, especially since we married there. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant the laws were different, that the marriage had consequences in places I didn't live anymore, that decisions I made without thinking about them could follow me longer than I expected. She wasn't threatening me. She was educating herself. That made it worse. I started noticing how often she framed things around timing, how long I'd be gone, when decisions would need to be made. What would happen if I stayed longer than planned? She spoke like someone mapping exits, not planning surprises. One night, she asked if I'd ever thought about splitting assets fairly if things didn't work out. I told her I hadn't. She asked if I thought it was fair that she'd rearranged her life around mine. I told her that wasn't how I saw it. She didn't argue. She just listened. I could feel the imbalance then, clearer than before. Not just money, power, information, control. I had introduced uncertainty and then withheld clarity. I told myself I was protecting myself, but from her perspective, I was holding the future just out of reach. The job offer firmed up. They wanted me there in 6 weeks. I told Adriana the next day. She asked whether I planned to accept. I said yes. She asked whether I expected her to come with me. I said I didn't know yet. That was when she stopped pretending. She told me she needed to make decisions based on facts, not possibilities. That she couldn't put her life on pause waiting for me to feel reassured. She said she wasn't angry. She said she just needed to stop reacting and start choosing. A few days later, she told me she was moving some of her things to her mother's place for a while. Not all of them, just enough to have space. She packed calmly, folded clothes, labeled boxes, took the folder with the documents. I helped her carry things to the car. Neither of us cried. Neither of us argued. At her mother's place, she hugged me longer than usual before getting out. I need to see what it feels like to stand on my own again, she said. I told her I understood. I meant it, and I didn't. The apartment felt larger after that. Not empty, just rearranged. Like furniture had been moved and my body hadn't adjusted yet. She still came by. We still talked. But the conversations were different, more direct, less forgiving. A week later, she told me she'd filed paperwork. Not divorce yet. A legal separation. She explained what that meant. Time. Process. Options. She also explained something else. Because we were married in the U.S., assets accumulated during the marriage were subject to U.S. law, not Mexican law. And under those rules, things were split evenly unless otherwise agreed. I asked her if that was what she wanted. She said she wanted fairness. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I had created the conditions for this. I'd pushed for clarity without offering stability. I'd tested commitment without accepting the cost of the test. She wasn't taking anything that wasn't allowed. She was preparing for a future where she couldn't depend on my uncertainty. The paperwork moved faster than I expected. Bank statements, asset lists, transfers. Watching numbers change on a screen felt stranger than losing cash ever would have. It was quiet, clean, impersonal. Half. That word started meaning something different. Half my savings, half the buffer I'd built for emergencies, half the margin that made retirement feel manageable. Adriana didn't celebrate. She didn't apologize. She treated it like the outcome of a process neither of us had stopped. When it was done, she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She nodded, said she hoped the job worked out. The last time she came by to pick up the rest of her things, we stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. She thanked me for what we'd had. I thanked her for being honest. After she left, I sat at the table and opened my laptop. I pulled up the job details again, the salary, the contract length, the start date. I did the math. It worked. Barely. For the first time since I'd retired, I looked at job listings without curiosity or pride, just necessity. I'd wanted an answer to a question I couldn't shake. What I got instead was a result I hadn't prepared for. The test was over, and it hadn't proven what I thought it would. It had only shown me how quickly stability turns into exposure when fear is the thing making decisions. Once the money was divided, everything else felt smaller. Not easier, just reduced. The job in the U.S. started on a Monday. I flew out 2 days before, carrying more paperwork than clothes. Adriana didn't come to the airport. We'd already said what there was to say, and neither of us wanted to turn it into something ceremonial. I told myself I'd focus on work. The job itself was fine. Temporary, contract-based, the kind of work people give to someone when they don't want to train anyone new. I sat in borrowed offices, logged into systems that weren't mine, fixed problems that existed because no one else wanted to touch them. It paid enough. That was the problem. It only paid enough. Rent, utilities, insurance, travel back and forth, everything added up faster than I expected. The cushion I'd built for retirement was thinner now, and every decision brushed up against it. I started noticing prices again. Gas, groceries, things I hadn't needed to think about in years. At night, I stayed in a small furnished apartment the company arranged. The furniture didn't match. The walls were bare. I left things where they landed because there was no point organizing a place I wouldn't stay in. Adriana checked in once, a week after I arrived. A short message. She asked if I'd settled. I said yes. She said she was glad. That was it. I didn't hear from her again. The separation paperwork moved forward while I worked. Emails from lawyers arrived between meetings. Documents to review. Signatures to confirm. I handled them in the evenings, sitting at a table that wasn't mine, using a pen I'd picked up at a hotel front desk. The final agreement came through on a Thursday. I read it twice. Everything was correct. Everything was legal. Nothing was surprising. Still, seeing it laid out made it feel final in a way the conversations hadn't. I wired the remaining funds that were required. Watched the confirmation number appear on the screen. Closed the laptop and sat there longer than necessary, hands flat on the table, like I was waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. When the contract ended, they offered to extend it, not enthusiastically. More like they didn't want to look for someone else. I said yes. By then, the idea of returning to Mexico felt complicated. Not because of Adriana, because of money. I went back once to collect the last of my things. The apartment looked different with fewer belongings. Cleaner. Less lived in. I packed what fit and left the rest. Gave some away. Threw out things I'd planned to keep. I stood in the doorway before locking up and tried to remember what I'd expected my life there to turn into. I couldn't line it up with what had actually happened. Back in the USS, I stopped telling people I was retired. It felt dishonest. I worked. I worried about the next contract. I checked my account balances more often than I wanted to admit. Sometimes, late at night, I replayed the early days with Adriana. The office near the plaza. Coffee after her shift. How easy things had been before I decided ease needed proof. I didn't blame her. That surprised me. She hadn't taken anything she wasn't allowed to take. She hadn't lied. She hadn't rushed me into anything. She'd responded to the situation I created. That was harder to sit with than anger would have been. I'd wanted certainty. What I got was consequence. The job ended for good 6 months later. No extension this time. I found another contract, shorter, less stable. I told myself this was temporary, that I'd rebuild enough to stop again. But the math didn't work the way it used to. Some evenings, I searched listings in Mexico again. Out of habit, maybe, or nostalgia. I didn't save anything. I just looked. Other nights, I searched for permanent positions, full-time work, things I thought I was finished with. The idea of starting over again at my age didn't scare me. What scared me was realizing I'd already done it once, and done it badly. I'd gone looking for reassurance and ended up dismantling the one thing that had been working. I'd tested loyalty without understanding what marriage actually meant once money and law were involved. I don't tell this story because I think I was wrong to want security. I tell it because I confused control with protection. And because sometimes, when you press on something to see if it holds, you find out it was holding only because you hadn't leaned on it that way before. I still think about Mexico, not as a mistake, as a place where I learned something too late to be useful, but early enough to matter. The last time I checked my bank balance before going to bed, the number was lower than I liked, but not zero. I shut the laptop, set the alarm, and went to sleep knowing that whatever came next wouldn't feel like retirement. It would feel like work. And this time, I wouldn't be able to say I hadn't seen it coming. I didn't move back to Mexico. I told people I might. I even told myself I might. But every time I started looking seriously, checking flights, pulling up old neighborhoods, thinking about where I'd live, the numbers came back first, before any feeling did. They didn't work. The job ended the way contract jobs usually do. A short call. A thank you. An email with instructions about returning equipment. No hard feelings, just finished. I took another contract after that, then another. Each one shorter, each one paying a little less. Not enough to panic, but enough to notice. I stopped calling it retirement altogether. I rented a smaller place. Not because I had to right away, but because it didn't make sense to keep pretending I needed space for a life I wasn't living. I'd boxed up things I'd carried from house to house for years and realized I didn't miss most of them once they were taped shut. Some nights I cooked. Other nights I didn't bother. I stopped planning meals ahead of time and bought what I needed on the way home from wherever I'd been working that day. My routines adjusted again, the way they always had. Adriana didn't reach out. I didn't either. There was nothing left to clarify. Every once in a while, something would remind me of her in a way that didn't feel dramatic. a brand of coffee I hadn't seen in a while, a folder at work that reminded me of how carefully she kept documents together. Those moments passed on their own. I didn't chase them. What stayed longer was the awareness of how much of my life had been shaped by avoiding discomfort. I told myself I was being careful when I introduced uncertainty into the marriage, that I was protecting myself from future regret. But what I was really doing was trying to force certainty out of something that didn't offer it. Marriage doesn't work that way. Neither does trust. I didn't lose everything. That matters. I still have options. I still work. I still pay my bills. I'm not telling this story from a place of ruin, but I am telling it from a place of consequence. I learned how quickly stability can turn into exposure when you treat relationships like systems instead of people. I learned that laws don't care why you made a decision, only that you did. And I learned that wanting reassurance is not the same thing as being ready for the outcome of asking for it. Some weekends, I still wake up early out of habit, make coffee, sit at the table longer than necessary. The difference now is that I don't pretend those hours belong to me in the same way they once did. Work dictates more than I expected it would at this stage of my life. That part stings. People sometimes ask if I regret moving to Mexico. I don't. I regret believing that I could control what mattered most by reducing risk. I regret mistaking fear for wisdom. I regret thinking that loyalty could be measured without being affected by the measurement. If I'd never said anything, never introduced doubt, never framed my future as unstable, we might have stayed married longer. Or maybe not. I don't know. That's the part I have to live with. What I do know is that I changed the conditions and then acted surprised by the result. Now, when I think about the future, I don't imagine starting over somewhere else. I don't imagine another relationship. I imagine staying where I am and making decisions that don't need to be tested to feel real. I still believe in being careful. I just don't believe in testing people anymore. Because the last time I didn't prove anything about her. I proved something about myself, and it cost more than I expected to learn it.